Again, I would like to welcome everybody to today's Paul S. Baines Transit in the Parks Technical Assistance webinar titled Alternative Transportation Systems Business Model Selection Guidance webinar. We do have three presenters today. The first presenter is Justin Bagley. He is a Senior Research Associate at the Center for Urban Transportation Research. We have Andrew Valdez, who is the Public Lands Transportation Scholar with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And finally, we have Ann Jocelyn, who is also a Senior Research Associate with the Center for Urban Transportation Research. A complete bio for each one of our presenters can be found in the handout section of live meeting. With that being said, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Ann Jocelyn, who will go over the agenda and begin section 1 of the presentation today.
Yes, good afternoon or morning. Thanks for joining us today. I just wanted to do a quick overview of today's agenda so you will know the items that we plan to cover today. We're going to start off by giving you an overview of alternative transportation systems or ATS business models. We'd like to describe to you some of the tools, and by tools I mean contracts and agreement types that are used to facilitate business models. We'll conduct a case study presentation of Sabino Canyon's ATS. We will give you an introduction to the ATS Business Models Decision Support Tool that we've created, and then a demonstration of how to use the Decision Support Tool. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Ann Jocelyn, and I am with the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida. We are one of the partners in the Transportation and Parks Technical Assistance Center, or the TRIPTAC. And we conducted some research based on a request that the TRIPTAC received from the National Park Service. They were interested in getting a better understanding of what kind of ATS were in operations across the country, and to gain a greater understanding of what some of the common elements are in some of the various contracts and agreements, as well as some of the differences. We'll start off by just defining what is alternative transportation. And basically, alternative transportation means any transportation by bus, rail, or other public or privately owned conveyance that provides transportation to the general public or a special service on a regular basis, and this includes bicycle facilities, pedestrian, and other non-motorized watercraft. For purposes of today's presentation, we're defining the ATS business model as a cohesive set of strategies that FLMAs utilize to deliver mobility services that mitigate the negative impacts of personal auto travel to and within federal lands, or those that allow for visitation to otherwise inaccessible areas. As I mentioned to you, we conducted, actually it was a two-phased effort. The first was to do basically just an overview of a business models evaluation within federal land management agencies. And then the second effort was to create the tool that we'll show you a little bit later on in today's presentation. To kick off the phase 1 analysis, what we did was collect a large variety of contracts and agreements. And as you can see from this slide, the bulk of those were from the National Park Service. We also did look at some contracts and agreements from the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as a few other ones that were not involving any land management agency, or contracts designed to serve land management agencies, but the land management agency was not actually a party to the contract or agreement. Here's a breakdown that will show you the various types of agreements that we did analyze for this effort. By far, the most were involved concessions contracts, which we'll describe to you in a little more detail later on, and those were followed by service contracts, which we'll also describe to you. I know this slide is difficult to read, but we wanted to just give you a feel for some of the items that we documented and cataloged for each of the contracts and agreements that we did analyze. As you can possibly see, we broke these down into the type of contractor agreement. We characterized documented some of the various service characteristics, reporting characteristics, a little bit about the fee structure for the contracts and agreements, as well as environmental concerns and other responsibilities related to interpretive services. The full document, which we'll show you how to access later on, has the details of each one of the contracts and agreements, which you could review at a later date if you'd like. So there are really four major types of business models used in ATS delivery. The first is commercial services, the second is partnerships, the third service contracts, and the fourth owned and operated arrangements. In the commercial services business model, what the FLMA provides an opportunity to a third party through a contract authorization or permit to operate the ATS in exchange for some sort of financial reward. The third party pays a flat fee or a percentage of revenue to the FLMA for the privilege of providing the service. The important part of this model is, again, that the third party is able to generate revenue and then is rewards the FLMA with some portion of that revenue. The partnership business model is pretty self-explanatory. In this arrangement, the FLMA enters into a mutually beneficial agreement with one or more stakeholders to provide the ATS. Examples of partners would be friends groups or other special interest groups. The third type of business model is the service contract business model. In this arrangement, the FLMA contracts with a public or private sector provider who has expertise and or the capacity to operate ATS. The important part of the service contract business model is that the FLMA has to pay the service provider to provide the service. And then in the fourth business model, the FLMA owns vehicles and the infrastructure and operates the system with unit staff. There are variations on this particular model. Sometimes volunteers are used to supplement the service, and in some cases the FLMA may use or have a contract with another entity to provide maintenance service, for example, for vehicles. At this point, we'll stop and see if anybody has any questions.
All right, Ann, thank you so much for that first section. Yes, we're going to stop at this particular moment in time. If you have any questions for Ann, simply press star 8 on your telephone keypad or use that Q&A manager located in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Simply click Q&A, type your question or comment, and click Ask. And it looks like we do have a couple questions. The first question is, are concession contracts the most prevalent ATS arrangement in all FLMAs?
I can't say that's the case in all FLMAs. I do believe it is probably the most prevalent business model within an NPS. I know I looked at an inventory that was done in 2012 of about 140 some odd NPS units, and by far, I think it was 60-some% did use the concession contract business model. But I can't say that to be the case with the other FLMAs.
Okay, we do have another question. It says, what about a model in which NPS owns the vehicles and service providers operates it?
How prevalent is that? Is that the question?
I guess it's more of a statement, but I guess does that What about if an NPS owns the vehicle, but then they contract it out for a service provider operates the vehicle? Does that fit into one of the categories?
Yes, yes. As I mentioned, there are some purely owned and operated systems, but others that do involve another party.
Yeah, and that would be a variation of actually many service contracts. I shouldn't say many. There are examples of service contracts where only labor is contracted or only a certain facet, but it still consists of a contract you have to have with a third-party private provider to get service.
Okay, thank you, Justin. And I'll ask one more question, and then we'll move on. Was the availability of funding or funding sources part of the analysis?
I can jump on this one.
Yeah, if you would, Justin.
So we showed you an example of the first phase in which we provided a look at 60 or 70 contract and agreement types, and we described the financial arrangements within those. Also in that first phase of the study, we described the funding types available to each of the FLMAs. There's some variation. NPS has certain properties with a transportation fee, many properties that do not. Some FLMAs have different fee types available. You have all the federal grant availability. You also have the opportunity to get private dollars, friends group money. We tried to describe a lot of that in the first phase. However, it didn't become part of the decision support tool in what we're about to describe. So the reason for that is it's a little bit outside the scope of what we were doing, and there's some other studies out there that get into that in a lot better detail than we could. So the focus of our business model decision support tool does not take into account that kind of financial information, other than to say it is structured within a what models may be more financially sustainable than others, but we'll get into that in more detail as we move on.
Great. Thank you, Justin and Ann. And with that, we're going to start section 2.
Yes. In this section, what we'd like to do is describe to you some of the characteristics of the various tools, and again, by tools we mean the contract and agreement mechanisms that are used to facilitate the 4 major business model types that we just described to you in the previous section.
Okay.
Oops. Okay.
Okay, that's okay.
Okay.
We do have a poll question for you. It says, which of the following best describes your situation? We currently have ATS and it is working well. We currently have ATS and it may require some modifications. We don't have ATS but are involved in the planning process, or you're just attending this webinar for informational purposes. Okay, and it looks like we have all of the results if you would like to discuss them at all.
Okay, that's interesting. I really anticipated that we would have more folks who don't have ATS and are involved in the planning process, but it looks like we do have quite a few folks who have existing ATS and are looking to make some modifications. And so hopefully this will give you some good information to follow up on. Now, in part, the legal and regulatory framework is going to impact the decisions that you make related to business models selection. There are a whole slew of laws and regulations and policies that are applicable to each of the FLMAs. Some of the laws are applicable to all FLMAs, such as the compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Civil Rights Act, and then others are going to be perhaps based on your region. I know, for example, there's the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which would apply to ATS in Alaska. If you're operating a waterborne mode, there are a number of maritime laws that you would have to comply with. So those will have some bearing on what you end up selecting. Here in this example, this just shows you that each of the FLMAs, NPS, Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, and Forest Service have all laws have laws that are specific to them, related to concession contracts, for example. In this slide, we're showing you just how it mandates what the terms of a concession contract would be. For example, NPS, it says you generally can have a concession contract for no more than 10 years, although there are some options to extend that in certain cases. And then Fish and Wildlife, for example, stipulates that you can have a concession contract for a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 20 years. There are other regulations that, well, let me back up a moment, please. Some of the other tools are not necessarily founded in law, but more so related to regulations and policies. For example, the Memorandum of Understanding, which we'll go over in a few minutes, does not have any foundation in law. In the case of NPS, for example, they provide policy direction regarding MOU, and the Forest Service does describe what can and can't be done within an MOU. So again, more policy guidance there. So we talked to you about commercial services being one of the four main business models. Within commercial services, there are three primary contracting tools. The first being a concessions contract, which we talked briefly about earlier. There are commercial use authorizations, and then special use permits. So we'll talk about concessions contracts. In concessions contracts, they're always competitively awarded. The concessioner has an opportunity to generate a reasonable profit, and then a key component of the concessions contract is that they return a percentage of the revenue they collect to the FLMA. The concession contract often bundle several types of services. Examples would be food and lodging, and the reason this is done is that food and lodging, for example, is generally more lucrative from a financial perspective, and transportation services rarely cover all of their expenses. We'll learn a little bit more about at least one exception to that rule from our next presenter. The Federal Land Management Agency, in some cases, will allow a concessioner to use their own facilities and or make capital improvements at the FLMA, and some concession contracts prohibit capital improvements. Again, within NPS, for example, the term is generally 10 years or less. Now, here's an example of one concession contract. Again, this one bundles the three types of services we talked about. At Glacier National Park, the concessioner operates 5 lodging locations, 5 different restaurants. They allow for retail, and then the transportation component involves a tour bus and a hiker shuttle. Here are 2 other concession contracts examples. In the Grand Canyon, there's a bicycle rental concession, and then at Golden Gate National Park, there's the Alcatraz Ferry. In both of these instances, the concessioner operates the transportation services as well as food and beverage service, but there is no lodging involved. The second tool for commercial services is what's called a commercial use authorization. These are used only by NPS. They involve a low level of staff involvement at the unit level. They're used when ATS is not required but is authorized. And generally speaking, what that means is the ATS is not mission critical to the unit. It's something that is nice and desirable by unit visitors, but may not be absolutely necessary in terms of, for example, reducing congestion or solving parking problems. The CUA's services must begin and end outside of the unit, and in this case, the CUA states that no NPS assets can be used by the provider. In other words, no buildings, that sort of thing. Now here's an example of a CUA at the Big South Fork National Recreation Area. In this instance, the CUA allows for trail rides that are offered by a lodge that's adjacent to Big South Fork. The trail rides begin and end outside of the unit, and the CUA holder pays a small fee to the FLMA in terms of basically a processing fee and a small fee for administrative services. Special use permits are used by NPS. They allow for a short-term ATS activity, and they are designed to benefit an individual or a group versus the general public. We only, in our research, only found or analyzed one SUP at NPS, so they're not very prevalent with NPS. And then the other FLMAs issue special use permits for a wide range of uses. In the case of the Forest Service, they actually issue an SUP to authorize a concession contract. So that's kind of a different twist on things. And as I mentioned, the first phase report, which will show you how to access, goes into a little bit more detail here for those of you who may be interested. So in summary, the pros and cons of commercial services is that they do offer opportunities to enhance the visitor experience in terms of the ATS. They're generally less dependent on FLMA funding. In fact, as we described, the concession contracts can generate a little bit of money for the FLMA. And then the capital and infrastructure costs can be built into concessions contracts, for example. The downside of commercial services is, in the case of a concession contract, is it may be difficult to replace the concessionaire if they don't perform up to standards. If you do determine that your concessionaire is not performing, you run the risk of not being able to find another concessionaire to step up and provide the services. And then the difficulty with the commercial use authorizations and SUPs, well, it's not a difficulty, but typically they are used for relatively small operations, probably not very suitable for an intensive, large ATS system. The second type of business model are partnership agreements. Partnership agreements are used to formalize activities and responsibilities with others who have a mutual interest in ATS. They draw on the strength of the partners in terms of their capabilities, their expertise, and in some cases, access to funds. There are a number of different partnership type agreements, and the appropriate one to use is typically dependent upon the type of partners involved, the purpose of the agreement, the role of the originating FLMA, and then again the FLMA's level of involvement. 5 major types of partnership agreements. There's the cooperative agreement, the interagency or intra-agency agreement, the MOU or MOA that we've talked about a little bit, a general agreement, and then the challenge cost share agreement. So the first, the cooperative agreement, is used when the principal purpose is to transfer a thing of value to the state, local government, or another recipient to carry out public purposes when it's for the direct benefit of the government. And the cooperative agreement is also used when there is substantial involvement is anticipated between the FLMA and the cooperator. Examples of substantial involvement means that the FLMA would play a role in reviewing the work of the cooperator. The FLMA may actually help select and train staff, and then they also have the ability to terminate the arrangement. In a cooperative agreement, competitive procurement is not required but is encouraged, and then these agreements don't entail any sort of punitive actions for a failure to meet goals or fulfill responsibilities. One example of a cooperative agreement that we found was between the National Park Service and the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad. In this particular arrangement, the NPS owns the railroad tracks, but they agreed to license the tracks for the use of the railroad, the scenic railroad. The NPS maintains the infrastructure. They allow for the use of their structures that they own associated with the railroad. And then they take responsibility for major renovations of the structures. The scenic railroad in this arrangement actually provides the vehicles. They purchase the locomotives and the equipment. They provide maintenance, and they actually serve as the operators of the service. They do some regularly scheduled excursion services as well as some special services, wine tastings, and that sort of thing. A second example of a cooperative agreement is at Acadia National Park, which has proven to be a very successful arrangement between the Park Service and Down East Transportation, which is a private nonprofit operator. In this arrangement, NPS plans and develops the shuttle service. Here's an example of some substantial involvement. They're very much engaged with Down East Transportation. They take responsibility for promoting the service. They seek out funding from state and federal sources, and they provide operating assistance. In the particular contract that we reviewed to Down East Transportation, that one was in excess of $1 million for a one-year term. In turn, Down East Transportation serves as the operator of the bus service there. They take responsibility for preparing and distributing informational materials. They also take responsibility for updating some of the signage, and again, they serve as the operator for the buses. The second type of agreement is the interagency agreement, which authorizes one federal agency to requisition services from another. And they're designed to basically share facilities, services, or employees. In our research, we didn't find any examples of interagency agreements. That's not to say there aren't any, but at least of the 60-some contracts that we reviewed, we didn't find any interagency agreements. Then the third tool is a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement. These are used to document a cooperative relationship between two or more parties, designed to eliminate duplication of efforts. And the key characteristics of an MOU or an MOA is that nothing of value can be exchanged. You can't pay for services, you can't assign property, that type of thing. Now, in this example, we looked at an MOU that was between the Bureau of Land Management and the International Mountain Bike Club and Bicycle Colorado. Again, an example of a friends group partnering with the land management agency. And what happens here is the cooperators agree that they will organize trail building schools, they'll develop and distribute educational materials, work together with the BLM to identify projects that are mutually beneficial, and then they actually get down into the maintenance of the trails at BLM. Now here's a second example of an MOU. In this case, it's in San Juan, Puerto Rico. There are 3 parties to this agreement. The first being the National Park Service. They agreed to purchase vehicles. They repair roadways in the parks that the vehicles travel on. They take responsibility for repairing vehicles, and they actually provide the interpretive training to the drivers. So that's what NPS does in this arrangement. Then they partner with the City of San Juan, who takes responsibility for providing vehicle insurance, performing routine maintenance, but they are prohibited from using the vehicles for any other type of service than the regularly scheduled service to the park there. And then the third partner to this agreement is the Corporation for the Development of San Juan. I think it must be some sort of development board for San Juan, I guess. They provide the drivers for this service. They take responsibility for storing the vehicles. They complete necessary reports, which are then provided to NPS in terms of maintenance activities, inspections, and accident records, that type of thing. Now, a general agreement is something very similar to an MOU, but it's used only by NPS. Again, it does not commit NPS to any form of financial assistance similar to an MOU. It's used as a generic instrument that establishes an administrative framework. I think in the past, this use of a general agreement came about as a result of perhaps there were some contracts that were or some MOUs that were developed when in reality they probably should have been something more along the lines of a service contract. So again, here's when some policy directives came into play. I think it was in early 2001 that there was a director's order to transition away from MOU and MOA within NPS and move towards the use of a general agreement. A third tool is the challenge cost share agreement, and that again is pretty self-explanatory. Basically, in the challenge cost share, funding is split between partners. Federal funds are used to leverage funds from other sources, be they private or public partners. In this example, a challenge cost share agreement is used at Bridger Teton National Forest and the Friends Group, Friends of Pathways. The Friends Group agrees to assist with maintenance of trails, and then they meet with the Forest Service annually to identify and prioritize projects. The Forest Service then agrees to reimburse the Friends Group. It's a small amount, $15,000 a year, for any expenses they incur. And again, they take some responsibility for working with the Friends Group to identify and prioritize projects on an annual basis. So we've talked a little bit about the various types of partnership agreements. Obviously, one of the great benefits of having an available partner is that you can level support from them in terms of labor to maintain trails, to develop and prioritize projects. The good thing about the partnership agreements is that they're relatively easy to terminate if there's a need to, due to non-performance or that type of thing. One of the downsides is that some of the partners can have more stringent administrative requirements typically associated with maybe some of their funding sources. In a partnership agreement, you may have a little bit less control of the service than you would in another type of arrangement. More potential points of failure. I think that's kind of important in terms of the San Juan agreement that we looked at. Each of the partners plays a very critical role in that arrangement. one who provides vehicles, one who provides drivers, one who provides insurance. So if any one of those partners were to drop out of the agreement, it would be very difficult to respond in a quick fashion. And again, the cons is that the partners could easily withdraw if they wish to. So at that point, we've covered the two major types of business models, the commercial services and partnership agreements. So we thought we might stop there and answer any questions you may have.
Great, Ann. Thank you so much. Again, simply use that Q&A manager or press star 8 on your telephone keypad if you would like to ask Ann a question. And it looks like we have one comment and then a couple questions. The first comment says, Acadia Island Explorer, this is just a comment, is a bus system that primarily serves surrounding communities, but also happens to serve the national park.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that.
Okay. The question is, in commercial services agreements, who is typically responsible for capital and reinvestment?
Oh, gosh. I think that would be very different in different circumstances, and I know that's a big issue. We've heard quite a lot about that. So I don't know, Justin. Maybe you can think of an example off the top of your head. I know we learned a little bit about the Big Red Bus, and that was sort of an interesting arrangement where the fees, let me see how that worked. There was a reserve fee established that was used to repair the vehicles. And then if that reserve fund was not used for repair, it could be used to purchase vehicles, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Stephanie, you mentioned, I'm sorry, the question was about capital purchase as part of the concessions contract?
It says, in commercial services agreements, who is typically responsible for capital reinvestment?
Okay, so that, from the ones that we read, if you look at all commercial services, anything having to do, we'll knock this one out quickly, with a CUA, which is NPS only, capital purchase and investments are not part of that authorization. So for that type of commercial service, there would be none. Now, if we focus just on concessions, typically you have a number of arrangements. I know in NPS it's called leaseholder surrender interest. If there's investments made by the concessioner on the property, that talks about how to depreciate and transfer the value of those. I know another one of the FLMAs has, if there are capital purchases or improvements made, they become property of the FLMA. I want to say the majority of the concessions contracts we looked at, the capital purchases were burdened onto the concessioner, and that is part of the prospectus or business case that's written up before the bid goes out. So typically that's looked at, those costs are expected to take place over the 10 or 20-year term of a concessions contract, and they're built into the contract. They're built into the financial expectations or burden to the concessioner.
And then I would also add, too, that it's not always the situation where the concessioner provides the vehicles. So sometimes I guess the FLMA would be responsible. They own the vehicles and then allow the concessioner to use them. So at the end of the vehicle's useful life, depending upon how the contract was structured, it might be the responsibility of the FLMA to secure additional capital.
Okay. And let's move forward onto the second part.
Okay, so in this section, what we wanted to do is to describe the second two types of business models. The third being the service contract. And basically, service contracts are used to formalize a relationship that carries obligations and monetary consequences for non-performance. They're used when the primary purpose is to acquire property or services for the direct benefit of the federal government, and in cases where the FLMA decides the procurement contract is appropriate. The service contracts typically result from a formal solicitation. based on the contracts that we saw, there were all sorts of different arrangements. Some where the contractor was required to provide a turnkey operation, meaning they provide the vehicles, the maintenance, the insurance, but then there were other examples where the service contract was designed for only a specific element of the ATS. There are 5 major service contract types. I won't describe all of them here, but of those that we reviewed, primarily they were fixed price contracts whereby the FLMA agrees to pay the contractor, the service contractor, based on service hours. But there was also some opportunities, many of them had some opportunities to contract or expand service by a certain percentage. For example, the service contractor provided X number of hours per day or per year, but if the FLMA decided it needed a little bit more, the contract allowed for a 10% increase in service levels, whereby the contractor would be reimbursed for that additional service. And we also saw some examples where the service contract allowed the FLMA to contract service a little bit if perhaps it was a new service and demand wasn't quite what it was expected to be. One of the things that we also looked at was how incentives were used in service contracts. I think the NPS thought that might be a good option to explore. We did see some examples, not too many, but for example, one contract would reward the contractor if they operated without any accidents for a period of time. Others were rewarded when they minimized their breakdowns or out-of-service vehicles, that type of thing. Rocky Mountain National Park is a good example of a pretty well-developed service contract. This one was a little bit interesting because it started out as a concession contract and morphed into a service contract with a private provider. This particular service serves the gateway communities, and similar to what was somebody commented about Acadia and a park and ride lot. This service was developed to address parking constraints. That was a big issue there in Rocky Mountain National Park. And again, in this example, the contractor provides a turnkey operation. They actually provide the vehicles, maintenance, operations, and facilities. At Harper's Ferry, there's a little bit of a different twist on the service contract example. Harper's Ferry contracts with the local transit authority, not for vehicles, but for bus drivers and maintenance workers. This particular service operates between the visitor center. So the good thing about a service contract is that you can often contract with somebody who has a lot of expertise and resources, meaning vehicles and staffing, to provide your ATS. You have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you structure the service contract to get exactly what you need. And again, you can structure it so that you have a little bit of flexibility. And the example I used earlier about the ability to modify the hours of service, that kind of thing, if the need arises. One of the things you can find is that the service contractors might risk service quality for cost efficiency. And the big downside of a service contract is, again, it requires a reliable and reoccurring subsidy. I think we mentioned earlier, very rarely does an ATS generate enough money to cover expenses. A service contractor might be able to defray expenses a little bit, but in general, the FLMA is going to pay almost the entire cost, if not the entire cost of the overall operation. Now, the fourth type of business model is the owned and operated, which we touched on a little bit earlier. Obviously, a fully owned and operated system is not going to have the tools or the contract and agreement types we're trying to describe here. However, they should have an operating plan or a business plan that lays out the roles and responsibilities of the staff and that sort of thing. Oftentimes, the unit staff actually operate the vehicles, although sometimes they can be supplemented with volunteer support. And as we mentioned earlier, some of the owned and operated systems rely on contracts with nearby entities to provide maintenance services, for example. Now, at Scotts Bluff, now here's an example of an arrangement where the National Park Service does own the vehicles. The vehicles are operated by park rangers. And this one is a little bit unusual. I think the general thinking is the owned and operated systems are not the best way to go. But in the case of Scotts Bluff, I don't know that there are too many different options. Scotts Bluff, I haven't visited there, but from what I've read, this bus service operates, well, it's designed to serve visitors who arrive in really large vehicles, because in order to get to the summit of Scotts Bluff, you have to drive up a very steep, winding road that can't accommodate a large vehicle. So the service isn't operated on a regularly scheduled basis. It's sort of an on-demand service. Now, given the nature of on-demand service, it's highly unlikely that you would find anybody that could, when I say anybody, a business that would be willing to sort of be on standby, I guess, to respond to visitors who arrive in a vehicle that can't travel the roadway, nor would the NPS want to pay somebody just to hang around there in case somebody does show up. That would be cost prohibitive. So this is a very limited ATS, but probably the owned and operated arrangement is the best option for them. In talking to some of the staff that are involved in the owned and operated systems, they felt like it was kind of a good thing in terms of the staff got a really good feel for what the visitor experience was like. In a couple of instances, they'd indicated that they could generate revenue that exceeded the cost of operations, particularly with some special events type services. And they thought that the flexibility to adapt service schedules based on visitor demand and weather issues was a positive aspect of the owned and operated. The downside, and we heard a lot about this, was it involved a lot of intensive program management, some extensive staff training was needed. They don't have the staff expertise to maintain or repair vehicles, and also that if you're using unit staff to operate transportation, it's taken away from some of their other job responsibilities. And, generally speaking, the FLMAs don't want to be in the business of transportation. So those were the pros and cons of the owned and operated arrangements. So right here we kind of want to summarize what are some of the risk considerations of the selection of the various business models. So if the transportation component is part of a larger concession operation, does it inequitably burden the operation and the concessionaire? And by that, I mean, I want to stress the idea of most ATS don't generate revenue. So if you put a lot of stringent requirements on the concession operator, it's costing them more in time and effort than maybe it should, and therefore you could actually lose concession opportunities. They can't make a lot of money on hotels and food and beverage services, and you're expecting them to do way too much in terms of the ATS component, you might be doing a disservice to the overall operations. So in the partnership arrangement, that's great if you have partners available. They certainly can enhance the ATS service delivery. But again, it's relatively easy for partners to drop out of the arrangement, and it could leave you holding the bag. In the service contracting business model, it's very, very important that you monitor, well, that first you create a service contract that is well thought out, and that you have opportunities to terminate the arrangement or penalize the contractor if they don't perform up to expectations. And then finally, what we just talked about in the owned and operated system, they're great in terms of offering some flexibility, but you have a lot of challenges in terms of labor and operations and what somebody brought up earlier, recapitalization of assets. And then finally, just to kind of summarize the financial sustainability of the business models, again, in almost all instances, funding to operate the ATS is going to need to come from something other than the system itself. You want something that you can sort of count on over time, some sorts of funding that's not dependent on a one-time allocation like a specialized grant, or funds that have time limitations. The concession business model or tool is generally thought to be optimal because it does generate revenues that are returned to the FLMA. The partnerships, again, I guess I touched on it just on the last slide, is great because you can use partners and to contribute labor and funding in some cases. Service contracts are generally thought to be maybe not the best option because, again, the FLMA is basically going to have to pay nearly the entire cost of the service contract. But they certainly have their place and are used effectively in many locations. And then finally, the owned and operated in terms of financial sustainability, not so great. And one of the reasons being cost can be very variable, and then certainly sensitive to external forces such as the cost of fuel. The fuel costs shoot up, and the FLMA is going to have to cover that additional expense, where in some of the other contract arrangements, the vendor or the partner bears responsibility for some of those fluctuating costs. So I think that concludes this first section of the presentation. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try to address them.
Okay, Ann, thank you so much. Again, please use that Q&A manager or press *8 on your telephone keypad. And it looks like we have one question. It says, in your reviews, how commonly are cooperative agreements used to leverage FLMA funding to attract other forms of federal funding?
I can't address that because, again, our financial analysis was very limited. We were looking primarily at the contracts themselves, so we didn't see or couldn't see what was done beyond the actual contracting tool. So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. And then the second part of that question is, are you aware of examples that serve only the FLMA unit and not the surrounding communities? Unlike the Acadia Island Explorer.
Let me think here. The example at Harper's Ferry, that service operates primarily within the unit itself, although not on the Harper's Ferry. unit route does offer some connectivity to other routes that outside, if that makes sense.
Okay. We're going to move ahead. Doesn't look like we have any more questions at this time, so we'll let Andrew discuss his case study.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Stephanie and Ann. Before I get started, I wanted to give just a little bit of background on myself. I'm a planner with a background in alternative and sustainable transportation. From Colorado, but currently working in Washington, D.C. at the Fish and Wildlife Service headquarters office in Arlington. I am, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, a public lands scholar. It's a program that's run out of the Western Transportation Institute, where TripTAC is, so that's my connection to TripTAC. And it's essentially an applied research fellowship to support FLMAs with transportation-related issues. So my first assignment was with the Coronado National Forest in southern Arizona, and they asked me here today to talk to you guys a little bit about my relevant experience in the field. So a little bit of background on Sabino Canyon and the Coronado National Forest. It's a 2 million acre urban forest, which means that it's adjacent to a major metropolitan area. This is, you can see on the left a map of Tucson and the city limits. And that lends itself to some real kind of unique issues relating to recreation, fire management, resource preservation, and of course transportation. So Sabino Canyon is a national recreation area, and it's basically just a Forest Service designation for a high-use recreation site. You can see it in the dark green there, cherry stems into the Push Ridge Wilderness. And that little green area gets about 1 million visitors a year, 18% of whom use the on-site transportation system. It's been in operation since about the 1970s, when the road in the canyon was closed to private vehicles because of resource damage concerns. And 18% is a very high number, very high usage for non-mandatory transit systems on public lands. Numbers generally tend to be closer to 5 to 6% for non-mandatory systems. And you can see the urban footprint goes basically right up to the forest boundaries on that satellite image on the top right. And that's the main parking lot there. At the crossroads, and then the canyon road begins at the parking lot and then heads up into the canyon. So a little bit of background on the shuttle system. When the road was closed, the Forest Service decided to issue what's called a special use permit, which we've talked about a little bit today, to provide the transportation services. And in the context of this presentation, this system would fall under a commercial services concession business model, where a private party concessionaire provides a service to the land agency in exchange for being able to charge compensation from the public. The Forest Service just calls this fee for service. And while the system is billed as a transportation service, it's really more of a ride and an attraction in and of itself. The people that want to hike or access the canyon for other recreational purposes don't really use the shuttle. And the Forest Service has many of these kinds of permits, mainly for campgrounds, and really not many, if at all, for transportation. So there really isn't a standardized process for competing the permit out. There wasn't boilerplate RFP process and special use permits. So that's why I was brought on board. And you can see what the rolling stock looks like there on the right. Open air. They were diesel-powered units, about 40-person capacity with the coach and trailer. And all the rolling stock is from about the 60s and 70s, so fairly vintage. And a little bit about the actual duty cycle. There's 2 routes in the system: Bear Canyon route, about 4 miles round trip, and then the Sabino Canyon route, 8 miles round trip. And it's sort of it's a challenging environment for vehicles. There's some steep inclines up to 18%, sharp turns, narrow stone bridges that were built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. You can see in the photo. And then water issues. Obviously, it's a desert canyon, so it's prone to flooding and heat and fire. So the reason I bring that up is because it really it limits the available rolling stock that's available just off the shelf. So when I got on site, I began some data collection to answer some key questions and inform the solicitation of the RFP that was going to be advertised. So really the first question was, should transit service be continued in Sabino Canyon? You know, the no build option, I think, is always on the table, and would the transportation represent a value add to the experience at Sabino? And then I tried to get into how are people using the system, were they hopping on and off, who were the riders, what were the demographic characteristics of the riders, what was the satisfaction levels, what were the complaints, what were the general comments, how is the service perceived by other users in the canyon. You know, while 18% is high, you've got 72% of other visitors that don't use the system, and their views are also very important. I also wanted to assess the relationship between the Forest Service and the concessionaire, and try to flesh out if that could be potentially any better through any kind of permitting process. What was the perception of the system in the community? You know, did people realize that the service was actually provided by a non-government entity? And what was the quality of the narrative experience? One of the key missions for the Forest Service is not only just transportation, but also interpretation and education of the desert landscapes. So after the data collection and analysis, I started crafting the RFP. So the first element there is sort of what's the vision for transportation in the canyon? What did the Forest Service want to see? What was the best case scenario for transportation in the canyon? And that started to inform what's called an operation concept. What are the components of that vision? And this is where you start to get into things like goals and measurable objectives. So in this case, through workshops and conversations with leadership and staff, it was transportation, education, and interpretation. And there were measurable objectives that fell out underneath all of those components. And then finally getting into a little bit further more detail, functional requirements. And this is where you can actually say the things that you want specifically, like alternative fuels, fire and evacuation protocols, ADA compliance, routes, headway times, things like that, to basically paint as clear a picture for the people bidding on the contract as possible. So, you know, getting back to this question, why did the Forest Service choose the commercial services concession in the first place? I think that special use permit arrangements are something that the Forest Service is very familiar with. As I mentioned, they manage, you know, thousands of campgrounds around the country and marinas and things like that. And this is an arrangement that's very easy for them to sort of process. It's very low maintenance for the Forest Service from an operations and maintenance standpoint, staffing, fee collection, procurement. Essentially, once it's set up, it runs itself, and the Forest Service can be hands off. The high visitation in this area makes a viable business model that can stand alone. We talked about this a little bit previously when Ann was talking about services having to be subsidized. This was a rare instance where the service and the system could completely stand on its own. And then there was this sort of political reason, which was sort of interesting to me, this opportunity for the government to support local business. They'll take that opportunity, and instead of, you know, there being more government, the government is sort of helping out local business and bolster the local economy. which is also a mandate in the transportation reauthorization bill. Now, from my experience, I can talk a little bit about some of the downsides that I saw in this instance of the concession contract. Long-term contracts or permits reduce the incentive to modernize once you've locked in a concessionaire. So the infrastructure and rolling stock might get updated, once every 15 or 20 years when you compete the permit out. You need about a 15 to 20 year timeline for it to be worth private investors to make the upfront investment in the rolling stock. Again, there's no real incentive to provide good customer service because of that essentially gold-plated 15 to 20 year contract. The Forest Service and other agencies do have some leverage to push back on this, but it can be politically difficult to unwind a contract like that. And one thing that I saw was that the public doesn't always understand that the concessionaire is not an agent of the government. So if there are customer service issues or there's some sort of a problem with the concessionaire, the government or the Forest Service or whoever, the rangers, can look bad, and it can create some confusion there. And also at a national recreation area, there's a recreation fee when you enter the parking lot, and there's also the fee for the transit system. So that I saw that cause some confusion among the public that they have to pay twice for this system. We've mentioned before in the presentation the potential for lapses in the service if there is any kind of dispute or litigation. And the unit doesn't really see any direct financial benefit. There is a fee to government that's built into all of the concession contracts, and that ends up being a percentage of gross revenue. But that money goes directly to the Treasury and not to the unit. In some very rare instances, permits like this can end up being quite lucrative, and that isn't really in the spirit of the special use program. And finally, like I was talking about earlier, it can be difficult to change the business model, even if you have identified a potentially a new business model that might work, that might function, a partnership agreement or something like that. You might get some political pushback. So hard to change retroactively. So just going back to my project and the project timeline, I delivered a draft RFP to the Office of General Counsel for the Forest Service here in Washington in about exactly a year ago, March of 2013. And in the original timeline, this RFP was supposed to advertise on the federal Fed BizOps clearinghouse sometime in April or May of that year. Unfortunately, the timeline has got pushed back. What ended up happening was Forest Service gave the incumbent permit holder about an 18-month extension so that the Forest Service could do a few things and make sure that they did all their due diligence, so when the RFP does go out, it'll go out smoothly. So things like updating the recreation concept plan, justify the overhaul of the system, do some public scoping. There was some NEPA compliance issues that they wanted to do. And then 18 months should be enough time to review applications, select a winner, and then the winning bidder needs time to procure the rolling stock and then ramp up operations, which can take some time, especially considering the limited vehicles that could work in this application. So best case scenario, a new permit issued by July of 15, and a new permit with the new operations concept and everything the Forest Service wants sometime next year. So just to wrap it up, lessons learned from my perspective, There are reasons why things are the way they are at a unit. So understanding that why, I think, is very important when you're in the field. You want to do a lot of listening, and you want to do a lot of data gathering, formal and informal. Change can take time. This project has certainly tested my patience, and I'm still peripherally involved in the project, even not even working for the Forest Service anymore. We didn't get into this too much, but alternative fuels are quite viable for heavy-duty cycle applications. We did a validation test with battery electrics in this specific instance through a Department of Energy project. But you do need to be careful when choosing new technologies, or you could end up with a very high-profile, very expensive mistake. And again, there are very few off-the-shelf options, especially for alternative fuels that work on public lands. The Fish and Wildlife Service has actually sort of pioneered this idea of battery electrics on public lands, and they've had some success in very small, very limited applications. But they're aggressively going after, especially electric vehicles on parks and public lands. And then the good news is that there's plenty of competitive interest from the private sector. So I think that, to me, underscores the need of a good RFP process and a good special use permit and good contracts before you get into a relationship with any kind of concessionaire. On that note, a good working relationship between your special uses administrator and the winning concessionaire is also very, very important, because that's the person that interfaces with the concessionaire. And again, a minimum probably, at least in this instance, of a 15-year permit to justify the upfront expense. We ran some cost models. But you still need to protect the government with ways to unwind the contract if you absolutely have to. And fitting in with the theme of this webinar, there really is no one-size-fits-all for these kinds of for a business model arrangements. You really just need to get on the ground, find out what's going on, do the data collection, do your due diligence, and see which one makes most sense for the specific application. So that wraps it up for me. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. It looks like we do have a question. It says, is there an opportunity for joint procurement for alternative fuel vehicles that would cover multiple FLMAs?
Joint procurement, nothing that I'm aware of. So there was, up until last year, a great program which a lot of you, I'm sure, I've heard about. It was the Sarbanes Transit and Parks program. It's funded at about $25 million a year, and money went towards projects like this. I don't know of any joint procurement instances, but if there was an instance where there's like a Forest Service that abuts another public land, a Forest Service unit that abuts another public land unit, there would be no reason why some of those funds couldn't be used for both. But like I said, unfortunately, that program went away, so now we have to get even more creative with the way we fund these things.
Okay, we have one more question before we move on to Justin's section. It says, how did you go about collecting data from user groups and the community at large regarding the perception of the shuttle service?
The perception. So informal contacts was just as valuable as the formal data gathering. So for the formal data gathering, I developed a survey and questionnaire, and I had 2 interns working for me from the University of Arizona, and they were administering random surveys to transit riders, both users and non-users of the system. And for the informal stuff, I lived in the town of Tucson, and everybody knows Sabino Canyon, and everybody knows the shuttle system, and everyone has an opinion on it. So whenever I had the opportunity, I would chat people up about what they thought about the system and use that to inform my process.
Okay, great. And with that, we're going to hand the presentation over to Justin. And
Hi, Stephanie. It's Justin. This is section 4, and it is the introduction to the ATS business model. Decision support tool. This is a short section. I believe we have a poll question, and then I'll go ahead and jump into an overview.
okay, this poll question says, which ATS mode is most utilized by your unit's visitors? So go ahead, take a couple seconds to respond. Simply press that radio button next to the choice. Looks like responses are still coming in. Okay, Justin, I'm going to go ahead and close the polls and show the results if you would like to respond.
Well, it looks like for those who do have an ATS, which is probably the predominant number, do have some sort of rubber-wheeled vehicle transportation. Also, there's quite a bit of waterborne transportation out there, as well as pedestrian activity. So it probably looks pretty reflective of that's what's out there. So sounds like we have the right audience targeted for what we're about to get into. All right, so just an overview of this section is we're going to introduce the tool itself and describe what it is and who could benefit from it. We're also going to talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the organization of the tool and how to use it. And I want to stress those 2 points because it's good to have a little bit of background or introduction to the tool before you were to look at this document in which the tool resides and start to use it, because there's a little bit of added functionality to just what's otherwise a standard PDF document. So you will need an Adobe Acrobat or an Adobe product to get the full functionality out. So as an introduction to the tool, it's structured as a series of questions that are really have been kind of distilled from a number of larger issues about business model selection. So Anne spent her time kind of describing to you the business model categories with the individual instruments and tools, and Andrew did a real good job of kind of putting that into practice and demonstrating how one of those is being used. So when we take that background, we can go ahead and structure a series of questions that'll help somebody who's either planning an ATS or has an ATS and wants to reconsider or reevaluate their business model. One point I think I want to make before we move on is that contracts and agreements, which have kind of been presented as part of a business model, can be used in combination or on their own within any single ATS. And an example would be, an ATS that's brought to life by a partnership, but it may also utilize a service contract. Also, the owned and operated systems, like Ann mentioned, might be a flavor of, an owned and leased system where vehicles are leased, or an owned system that has a certain level of contracting in it. And then finally, I just want to wrap up by saying the decision support tool, while it can be used by many, really it has the most substance to offer the motorized transportation services, and that sounds like it's kind of reflected in our audience and what we saw in the contracts that are out there. There's just more moving parts in some sense to the motorized systems than there is to some of the bike ped systems, which doesn't place an emphasis one over the other, but there's probably more assistance needed out there in the motorized section. So when we jump into the tool, what are we considering when we are using the tool, when we designed it? Really, we're just trying to point the user to an optimum model based on their conditions or situation. And the way, I think I mentioned this earlier, it is structured is we're prioritizing financial sustainability of your ATS here. And there have been some detailed questions about recapitalization and contracting and contributing, resources, leveraging local funds to get more federal funds. Unfortunately, we can't get into a lot of detail within this version of the decision support tool, but consider that has been taken into consideration when you're using this. We certainly recognize that FLMA's primary mission is not to be in the business of directly providing ATS, although it does happen, and it is the most appropriate model in some situations, but really it is not something we place at a high priority here within the tool. So if you do end up with some flavor of an owned and operated system, it's probably because you've exhausted your other options. And then finally, I just want to emphasize that this is a decision support only. Between different FLMAs and regional issues and unit level preferences, they're not accounted for here. This is a 50,000-foot view of the business model decision-making process. You're encouraged to always follow regional or local preferences where possible. Yet we are trying to emphasize some sort of standardization as part of picking business models. So the organization of the tool begins with a procedure list, and this is presented as a table. And really what you're going to see are two different slides here that are meant to be looked at side by side. Unfortunately, they're in two different slides, but really it's a procedure that's described in a table with a series of yes or no questions, or questions that are some variant of different options that may be considered as part of decision making. This doesn't come across real clear, but I'd encourage you to pay attention to the live demonstration. You'll see a bit better example of that. So the last slide showed you the table, and the table is complemented by the decision flow chart that goes with it, and here's just a small snapshot of that. It's a graphical representation of what's in the table, and it's also the more interactive of the two pieces. If you're using the Adobe product, I'll explain that in a second. So how would you use the tool? The tool is intended to begin from procedure 1 through procedure 4. There are a total of 4 procedures. And within each procedure, there are a number of sub-steps that contain the questions that are asked of you. And based on how you answer them, you're taken to another procedure, and sometimes you may jump around, and other times it's more of a linear process where you're just sent to the next question. And then finally, like I mentioned, if possible, if you're using this in Adobe, or if you're viewing this electronically, which is really the encouraged way to do it, the ability to pull up a side-by-side of the table and the graphical flowchart is probably the best way to do it. If you can't get the table up next to it, that's quite all right. You'll see very similar information between the two. So I was mentioning interactivity. What makes the document something beyond just a two-dimensional document you'd read from page 1 to page wherever it ends? Well, in order to get some functionality that allows you to jump around the document that's more efficient for how you want to use it, underlined text within the flowchart, as you see in this box, is hyperlinked to the resource material that supports that bubble. So again, I'll demonstrate in a moment, but when you see text that's underlined, if you mouse over it when looking at the document, it is clickable, and when you click it, it'll bring you to the exhibit or appendix, which contains the resource material that supports that particular point in the decision tree. Finally, when you're reading through a section that you may have been routed to from the tree, when you get to the end of it, if you're in a section that is kind of providing you background information, or you're going to continue through the tree, you'll have a red return bit of text there, which is also clickable. When you click it, you'll return to the table or the graph, the flowchart, so you can continue through your decision-making process.
Okay, Justin, thank you. Again, we'll stop for if anybody happens to have any questions. Justin, it looks like we do have at least one question. It says, can I make this bigger and easier to read?
Yeah, that's a good point. So another benefit of using this electronically is that you can increase the zoom level. I'll do that when we go ahead and demonstrate it. In order to fit some of these procedures in the graph, unfortunately, we had to sacrifice a bit of the real estate. So you really do want to use that zoom level to a comfortable place in which you can read. So I'll go ahead and do that when we demo it.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions at this time, so we'll go ahead and move on.
Okay. So this is the final section of the webinar. Thanks for sticking through the first hour and a half of it today. I don't think we're going to be too much longer here, but I do, for those interested, want to demonstrate a little bit about what I just described. What we're going to do is briefly show you a high-level view of all of the 4 business model categories in the next slide, and then we'll go into detail in the demonstration of, walking through a commercial services consideration scenario, and that will be used to kind of bring to life the tool as we're describing it. So here's the architecture of the tool, and what you see, and obviously you're not intended to read this slide, but you can see a little bit of the decision process that goes into it. And what you see here is we start off with the commercial services, because if you can kind of go back to what Andrew and Ann were saying, ideally ATS is going to be turned over to a commercial provider. Ideally, that commercial provider can create or operate a service that not only generates revenue, but enough revenue to cover expenses and generate an additional feedback to government. Whereas in Procedure 3, if we're in a service contract operation, it could be a much larger operation, and it probably, with a service contract, is going to require a bit of money from the government to get that operated. Often those systems do not recover in fees or fares the costs associated with them. So if that's just one small example, if you can understand, we want to start you with the commercial services, see if you're a candidate there. If you're not, we can kind of get you moving pretty quickly down the tree through the partnership possibilities. Then we'll look at service contracts if that's right for you, and then finally, we recognize that you got to have an ATS. Owned and operated may be the way to go for you. So before we jump into the demo, I just want to describe what we're about to go through. So the commercial services, we begin with trying to ask you, what level of assistance do you need, because there are a little bit of variety there. You may not need a full turnkey system from the ground up. You may have some level of work already done. You may have an existing business model, an existing ATS you want to reconsider. We want to provide access to some documents that can familiarize somebody with the business models and some business planning and transportation planning if you haven't already gone through that. And then, what are the criteria for a concessions opportunity? If concessions opportunity is right for you, what does that look like? How does that get off the ground? Clearly Andrew had gone through that process and described it in detail, so we're going to touch on that as well. And then finally, perhaps a concession is not right, or there's additional transportation needs beyond what a concession provides. Can we use instruments like a CUA or a special use permit to bring in additional service, or possibly to develop markets where there's not enough interest yet to support a concessions?
Okay.
So Stephanie, you could describe this one. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yep, that's right. At this time, the best option for each of you, since we're all dealing with monitors of different sizes and different resolutions, is to simply press F5 on your keyboard, as Justin's going to walk through using the decision support tool. So go ahead, Justin, go ahead.
Okay.
And give everybody a second to go ahead and press F5 to hopefully be viewing this.
Okay, I'm going to change the zoom down to a level I think will be a bit easier to see. Okay, so basically what you're looking at now is the final report was actually just released within this last few days of the decision support tool itself, and I'm going to go ahead and navigate this, kind of demonstrating how you might use it. So as I mentioned, the first thing to do, reading a bit of background leading up to this point, is you would begin at the tabular procedure. The tabular procedure precedes the graphical decision tree in every event. So for each of the 4 procedures, one procedure matched up for each of the business model categories that Ann had mentioned, we start with showing you in a tabular form the questions and possible answers that you could have for those. And there's a lot more specificity that could go into this. I just want to reemphasize or try to find a balance between usability of this and getting enough detail into it to make it useful for you. So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to kind of pass by a lot of the tables at this point, and I want to jump into the tree. And beginning at the tree over here on the leftmost side, the first question you're presented with is, which of the following three scenarios most closely describes your situation? I think for some, no existing ATS, full implementation, started from the ground up. This could even be used, and when you're, at the very preliminary planning stages, and could be useful there. Now, you may have an ATS, however, some facet of it may not be sustainable. It could be in operations. It could be the way it's maintained, financed, or administered. You're having issues. The tool can still be used for you, and you'd follow that similar flow. Now, you may have an ATS that has a sustainable business model. Everything is going great. However, you may want some more detail. You got another contract coming up or RFP to issue. You want to improve your vehicle, your rolling stock, as Andrew talked about that. Certainly, the ruggedness and the ability for some of these vehicles to last on some of the roadways they're operating on, that's another consideration. Perhaps you're considering alternative fuels. If you choose that block, you would be sent to the review business models for ATS or proceed directly to your model. Perhaps you have a service contract or you own an operated system. We're not going to subject you to this entire process. We're going to let you jump. I'm going to click the own and operated, and we're brought right to that procedure. And then there are some resource material for you here to use. Going back to the tree.
Hey, Justin, real fast. Just jump in real quick. I'm sorry. Even though you are viewing in full screen mode, some of you still may need to scroll either left or right to view some of the items that Justin is discussing, since these are, I think they are legal size, right? Some of these pages.
Yes, this is an 8.5 by 14 landscape presentation on this page.
Okay. So just, you may need to do some scrolling even if you are in full screen mode. I apologize, Justin.
No, that's quite all right. I'd rather people be able to view this than wonder what I'm talking about. So, so the next point in the decision tree is everybody on this webinar has probably listened to familiarizing yourself with ATS business models. If you haven't, and somebody else were to pick this document up and need some bit of that background without having to dive into a 200-page document, you can go ahead and choose that, and you're brought to the appendix. Where the business models are presented in a bit more straightforward manner to prepare you for the rest of the tree, so to speak. And there's a couple slides of that, but I'll go ahead and let you know it's there, and we'll go back to the tree. After you may have familiarized yourself with the models, the first question is have you done any planning up until this point, and particularly any formal planning beyond kind of some internal meetings or some discussions? I mean, do you have a business plan or a transportation plan for a forthcoming ATS or for something you're working on? And it's been mentioned, this process can take years. So there's a good chance if you may not have an ATS out on the street today, you're in the process or have done some work on it. If so, you'd go yes, and then you'd be presented with another question. But if you haven't, there's a section here to kind of brief you on the importance and background of a transportation or a business plan. And what are those things that you need to consider, and what's the work that you need to do to kind of get yourself ready for the rest of this. And really, it is recommended that you have some work done up until this point. You shouldn't be choosing a business model until you've got some work done. Jump back here. So the first question you're presented with is there an ATS business opportunity which will return revenue to the unit and afford an opportunity for a service provider to make a reasonable profit? That sounds familiar. It's because those are kind of the high-level criteria for a concessions contract. Now, again, you would have had to have had some background work done on a prospectus or a business case to be made if there's a concessions. Now, if that is the case and you're a candidate, consider development of a prospectus for a concessions contract. Here we have each of the four land management agencies broken out. I'm going to go ahead and choose the Fish and Wildlife concessions link, and what you'll see here is just a little bit of background on the authorizing law and language for performing a concessions contract in at Fish and Wildlife. And what you're going to see next is what we are calling the template that is based on the concession contracts we looked at for ATS for this particular land management agency. And so a lot of this is guided already, is provided to the land management agency for concessions contracts, whether they're ATS based or not. And there's some kind of standard boilerplate language in here. I'm not sure that we consider, that the value of what we're trying to help you with. I think what we're trying to get to you are the ATS specific language that you can drop into this concessions contract. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the end of the template, which is kind of the structure for where you should be putting your information in. And at the end of the templates for each of the land management agencies is a link to an exhibit. And that exhibit is about 30 or 40 pages of ATS supportive contract elements. And what we've got here are multiple examples of different language that can be used in contracts or solicitations, most likely, that become contracts. And they're not intended necessarily to be taken word for word, but one will provide you ideas. And here are things that have been used in other FLMAs, also that have been used in other types of contracts in ways that you can structure your contract to be, minimize risk, kind of equitably balance, financial responsibility. We have things in here about the quality of operations. How do you ensure quality control? What can you do? I mean, you can't solve every problem with a contract, but you can certainly write your contracts to be as tight as possible. And that's really what the focus of the material we're giving you is. If there's going to be maintenance of facilities, of vehicles, we provide that type of information here. I'm going to bounce around a little bit more. If you're going to be hiring ATS personnel, what are some requirements that you want to put on the concessioner in terms of knowledge, skills, abilities? That's in here, and that's again specific to operations of vehicles or waterborne vehicles that we have. There's a little bit of examples, some employee incentives. How do you facilitate better quality through incentives? What are the reporting requirements that you're going to put on your concessioner so you can maintain and monitor your concessions? Some language about how different ways to structure franchise fees, maybe a flat fee, it could be a percentage, it could be a variety of that. So, like I said, there's about 30 or 40 pages of those examples here under a number of different headings. So going back to the tree, in that event, I had concessions possibility. So we guided you to the template by the FLMA, and then everybody was guided to the exhibit with ATS supportive language. Now, it's possible that there isn't a concessions opportunity. It's very likely in some cases, but it may be that there is what we would call a market for something, but it's not mature enough to support a concessions opportunity. And in NPS, you have tools such as the commercial use authorization, and at the other FLMAs, a special use permit. That allows you at the FLMA to have some limited transportation services provided that really put a lot less risk on the FLMA for a limited amount of service. So in this event where we say not now, if we went to NPS, we're brought to a commercial use authorization guideline that includes an introduction to that tool. And what we did in this case is we compiled what we would call a sample CUA. And this would be kind of a way to structure your CUA language and the things you'd want to know from your CUA holder, or that you would grant it to. Things about fees required, the length of the CUA, and then I can tell you, without probably getting into too much detail here, there's some ATS-specific items in here We did look at a bit of the CUAs operating out of the Alaska area, and there's some pretty good requirements there that we built into this kind of sample CUA. And as always, how can you adapt what we provided you in the event that probably it's not going to be appropriate word for word for you, but you could take some of this language and possibly make use of it. And final time, I'm going to go back to the tree here. And so when you're given an NPS, a commercial use authorization, or a special use permit at one of the other agencies, we did, Ann brought up a case study earlier where those type of instruments were used to develop a market for something that eventually became a concessions. And I think that example was the bicycle rentals at the Grand Canyon, where there was a pretty good example there of a CUA that was opened up that was run for a few years. The NPS went ahead and took a look at the books that came back on that and realized it was quite a profitable venue, and they brought that CUA back in to reissue it as a concessions. And that's kind of the logic behind the arrows, the way you see them laid out here, is that we realize not in every case that's possible, but that is probably a pretty efficient way to use those instruments. The final thing I'm going to touch on here is if there's not a business opportunity, and it's not expected that there will be, you're brought down to partnerships, and you'll see here there's a dotted line to option 2 partnerships, and you would actually exit the commercial services section, and you'll be brought into the decision-making process for partnerships. I'm not going to go ahead and take you through the entire process, but it's very similar to what you just saw, and this continues on to service contracts, and I'll show you that. Here's a service contract decision-making process where we've got language about very similar to concessions contracts, but this is more geared more heavily towards performance, costing service, and a number of other items you see listed here. I'm going to revert back. And finally, the owned and operated business model decision trees here. And there's a lot less decision making here, and there's just more resource material about vehicles, maintenance, fuel cost arrangements, data collection and reporting, operations of system, and finally standard operating procedures, which are probably pretty crucial. If you're going to own and operate your system, you're going to need a very explicit list of rules and how you intend for that to be operated. So, Stephanie, that's it for me. I'm going to throw this back. I think I've shared out, or I've unshared my that application. If you want to put me back on task here, thank you. All right, so I'll go ahead and wrap this up with the summary. Consider the laws, regulations, and policies. That's kind of where we started this entire webinar, and touched on that. There needs to be an evaluation or a needs assessment for your ATS. That can come as part of your business transportation planning process. Kind of take inventory of what type of resources you have available, and that could be federal or local funding. What do the laws and regulations allow you to recover as part of fees, either for entrance or transportation fees? What might you have in terms of partnerships available to you? Consider the pros and cons of each of the business models. I think we really only hit on 3 or 4. There are some probably more detailed and nuanced pros and cons, and actually may change a little bit from FLMA to FLMA. So consider those, and then go ahead and select the appropriate business model for further consideration by your unit. Finally, here there's a summary here table. I won't read any detail on this. Know that in phase 1 of the study, this table is out there, and it provides you with some idea of particularly on risk and financial sustainability resource requirements of ATS business models. Additional resources, as always, we encourage you to visit the TripTAC website, which is shown here. There you can find a recording of today's webinar. There's also a resource library that would include the first and second phase of this study. really strongly encourage you to use the TripTech to access previously done webinars that fit nicely within the decision support tool. So, again, we tackled this from a very high level, and we were unable to get into tremendous detail on some things. If you look at the bulleted items here, many of these, if not all of these, previous webinars help deal with the more specific scenarios that we just can't cover as part of business model selection. But these things can certainly help you make those decisions.
Okay. Thank you, Justin, Ann, and Andrew. At this particular moment in time, we do have about 10 minutes left or so, and we would like to open up the floor for any questions that may that you may have had throughout the entire process. So again, you can simply use that Q&A manager located in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, or press *8 on your telephone keypad. And Justin, it does look like we do have a couple questions while we wait for some additional questions to come in. It says, does this apply to only one FLMA or all of them?
Well, I think we did a pretty good job here of trying to spread out the information. First of all, that's applicable to all the FLMAs. I mean, certainly, ATS procurement, provision, maintenance, administration is kind of FLMA neutral. But certainly when there's some difference in the templates used for concessions, there's some difference in the forms used for special use permits between agencies. So any FLMA can use this, but there's where we can be specific, we were. Otherwise, a lot of the information is kind of applicable to all of them.
Okay. Another question is, why does it say to consult with contract or agreement specialists in the decision tree?
That's a good question. So a lot of what we've provided here, we demonstrate, particularly in the templates. Those are kind of driven from a higher place than locally at the FLMA unit. So what we try to provide you here are the ATS specific elements that can be used in kind of a more universal solicitation that's dictated, at the certainly at the FLMA level. So we suggest we consult with contracts agreement specialists because, first of all, not every scenario can be covered in here, and you could probably work better in concert with those people in developing your RFPs or developing your partnership agreements. Particularly on the legal side, you want to make sure you're not committing your unit or the FLMA to something that's not allowable by law.
Okay. Another question we have is, from your research, what type of business models have been the most financially sustainable?
We didn't research that, but we did read some existing reports, some of them that were somewhat recent, that suggested, certainly, I think inherent in the concessions model is an element of financial sustainability, particularly because these are very long contracts, relative to some of the partnership agreements. They're very short. Service contracts, they tend to be shorter with renewable periods. Again, I'd kind of, without explicitly saying it, say that the decision tree is structured to take you through the most financially sustainable options through what might be the least. And we base that, on, unfortunately, the contracts themselves can't tell us whether this is a sustainable model. It just kind of says how it's arranged. But it appears as though the commercial services are the optimum model where you can use them, and certainly they can't be used in every situation.
Okay. Thank you, Justin, and for that question. It says, can the language from the sample templates be used?
Yeah, it can be used. Keep in mind that the majority of those are either somewhat verbatim from existing contracts, or they've been, slightly modified or made more generally applicable by taking out specific names of individuals, partners, organizations. We tried not to drag in too much of that information, only because it adds too much specificity for what may be useful for somebody else.
Great. And then it looks like we have a comment that's fairly lengthy, but I'll go ahead and read it. It says, this was an awesome effort. The information on the different business forms was extremely helpful, at least for our unit, which has no ATS currently beyond PEDS, bikes, equestrian paths, but is in the process of researching what ATS options would help us better meet our recreation and resource management goals. The decision tool will be fabulously helpful. So just a really positive comment from one person.
Oh, good. I was waiting for the but or however.
Oh.
But no. That's great. I mean, that's the idea behind this, and we really hope that it was created with the idea that it needed to be used, and we hope we didn't kind of spread ourselves too thin and not get enough detail, but at the same time, covered as much ground as possible. So I hope it can be used by somebody.
Great. At this time, it doesn't look like we have any other questions or comments at this time. I would like to say that a copy of the presentation, as well as a copy of this report that Justin did the demo on, the decision support tool, is available in the handout section of Live Meeting, and that is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. It looks like 3 white sheets of paper. Simply select the items you wish to download and download them directly to your desktop or computer. We would like to thank all of you for joining the webinar today. If you have any questions or need any assistance, please feel free to contact the TripTAC using the website, email, or phone number on the screen. And please take the time to fill out a survey that will be sent to your email in the next couple hours. So again, thank you all, and have a great rest of your afternoon.